Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Over the Gate by Miss Reed. We have been following the career of Sally, a retired housemaid who's run across an old recipe for losing weight. She lost a lot of weight. She lost so much she floated. There now began for Sally a period of engrossing interest and pleasure. After her duties at the big house, she hurried home to experiment with her essays in levitation. She found that by taking a small amount of the concoction, she could hover about a foot above the ground for a period of roughly 10 minutes. This gave her ample time to tidy shelves, wash out high cupboards, dust the picture rail, and so on, tasks which had always been irksome to one of her low stature. She found it wholly delightful to be without weight, and became skilled at balancing herself, with one hand touching a wall whilst the other performed its task. Naturally, she did not indulge in this secret practice every day. For one thing, she still feared that it might be discovered by her neighbors in Fairacre, and she had no intention of giving them cause for gossip. She found it prudent to keep her floating periods for Thursdays. Market day in Caxley was on a Thursday, and usually the other inhabitants of Tyler's Row spent their Thursdays hunting for bargains, meeting their friends, and catching up with their news amidst the market day bustle. Alone in her cottage, Sally felt safe from unexpected visitors and experimented with the mixture. One day she noticed that both the plum tree and the ancient Bramley seedling apple tree were heavy with fruit. She had wondered for some time if she might dare to practice floating out of doors, and this seemed the time to experiment. There was much to consider before she began. Of course, she must remain unseen by the neighbors. That was the first consideration. It would be wise, therefore, to wait until nightfall to make her first attempt. Then she must be careful to leave a considerable amount of fruit to be picked in the normal way, or her neighbors would wonder why she had not borrowed a ladder, as was her usual practice. Then, of course, there was the question of staying in her own garden. She shuddered at the thought of floating out into the blue, as well she might, if she did not take care. It was not so much the danger that worried Sally as the impropriety of such a mode of traveling. After considerable thought, she decided to tie a stout length of clothesline round her waist and to tie a brick to the other end. She would carry the brick, already tied, up in a basket with her. On attaining the correct height, she would throw the brick to the ground, remain safely tethered level with the fruit, pick it, and place it in the basket, and so get the job done. Of course, there was more to it than the general plan. For one thing, Sally had to calculate the height of the fruit from the ground, how much the brick should weigh, and how much of her mixture she needed to balance all these factors. But she was determined to try her luck, and one moonless night she crept from the cottage to embark on this adventure. It was very still and quiet. The windows in the row of cottages were dark. Not a soul stirred. St. Patrick's clock had struck 1 as Sally tiptoed down her stairs, and all Fairacre slept the dreamless sleep of those who live and work in the bracing air of the downs. A spoonful and a half of the revolting brew was doing its best to settle in Sally's affronted stomach as she approached the plum tree. Already her feet were skimming the grass, and she had hardly reached the gnarled old trunk before she began to rise swiftly. For a moment Sally was torn with panic. She felt horribly vulnerable out here in the open, and would have welcomed the painful crack of the kitchen rafter on her head at that moment. She clawed frantically at a substantial branch as she floated by, and paused to get her breath. Taking a tight grip with one hand, she groped inside the basket on her arm, found the brick, and cast it downward. It seemed to make the most appalling shindy, and also jerked Sally cruelly round the waist. Breathless, she listened. Supposing the neighbors were disturbed and looked out of their windows? Supposing the rope broke? Sally gripped the tree even more desperately in her agitation. But the silence engulfed her, and only the distant yelping of a stoat stirred the blackness, as a falling leaf might ruffle the satin smoothness of a still pool. Emboldened, Sally turned to her task. It was not easy, but it was wonderfully exhilarating to be at large in the tree-tops, and her basket was soon full. Weight returned to her in roughly half an hour, and Sally crept back to the cottage, basket in one hand, brick in the other, and went, highly elated, to bed. Time passed. A pot of the mixture stood permanently on Sally's larder shelf, and she began to take her ability to levitate almost for granted. She was wonderfully lucky in preserving her secret, although over the years she had one or two dangerous moments. One day, for example, she was cleaning her bedroom window inside, floating about 8 inches above the rush matting, when her neighbor appeared on the garden path below her and asked if she might borrow some sugar. "I'll be down in a minute," Sally replied, doing her best to keep her feet hidden from the sight from below the window-sill. "Shall I take a cup myself?" suggested the woman. "Save you leaving the windows like?" "No, no," answered Sally, trying to sound airy, as indeed she felt. "I'll bring it round the minute I've finished." "If she gets in here," thought Sally frantically, "she'll be upstairs in double quick time, and I'm aloft here for a good 5 minutes yet." The woman watched her closely as she undulated from one pane to the next. "What you standing on, gal?" she asked suspiciously. "My little old stool," responded Sally, tightening her hold on the curtain and concentrating her attention on one pane. "Don't you trouble to wait," she added hastily. "I'll be round in 2 shakes." To her infinite relief, the woman departed, but the incident left Sally severely shaken. It was several weeks before she dared to take another dose. Under cover of darkness, she often repeated her first outdoor experiment and picked fruit for pies and puddings, jamming and bottling. On one occasion, the landlord of the Beetle and Wedge had asked her curiously how she had picked her apple tree so clean, and she had quickly said she had given it a good old shake, and the wind had done the rest. He seemed to believe her. One late October day, when Sally was almost 60 years of age, she gazed with a speculative eye upon her walnut tree. This was a lofty beauty of great age, and heavy this year with magnificent nuts. Sally decided to lengthen her rope and to make an assault upon it. "'Tis Thursday," said Sally aloud, "and they all be safely at market. By tea-time it'll be dark enough to try." She made her preparations and made her way to the tree as dusk began to fall. The neighbors' cottages were empty and would remain so for a full hour, as she well knew. What she had not reckoned with was a freshening wind and the enormous collie puppy which came from the farm. The brick lay at the foot of the tree, half hidden in wet grass. Higher than she had ever been before, Sally plucked swiftly at the green walnuts, staining her fingers brown as the basket filled. The wind made things difficult, tugging at her skirts and lifting the boughs from her reach. It grew more boisterous each minute, and Sally began to feel alarmed. "I'll be downright thankful when this lightness wears off," she said to herself, clinging to a sturdy branch. At that moment, she became conscious of a rhythmic tremor running up the rope. There, busily gnawing at it just above the brick, was the collie puppy. Caution thrown to the winds, Sally screamed at him. "Be off, sir! Get away, you rascal!" The puppy wagged a delighted tail and continued his gnawing. His strong white teeth, busy at their task, seemed to grin at her. Sally began to pelt him with walnuts, but he was unperturbed. Slowly but surely the strands were severed, until a particularly fierce gust of wind caught Sally unawares, broke the rope completely, and jerked her violently from the walnut tree. Still screaming, Sally rose abruptly another 20 or 30 feet and began to twirl this way and that as the wind blew her on an erratic course clean across the village. Over and over Sally rolled like an escaped balloon, and soon she felt sick as well as frightened. But her innate common sense began to assert itself, and just as she had accepted the first ridiculous position against her own kitchen ceiling, so in this present predicament she did her best to come to terms with the situation. First, she stopped screaming. On no account would she draw attention to herself. She'd got herself in this pickle, and she'd get herself out of it. Luckily, dusk was falling fast, and with luck her progress through the sky would pass unnoticed. The roaring of the wind would distract people's attention from unusual sounds above them. Heads down against the onslaught, they would probably be intent on getting home, Sally comforted herself. Her own traveling arrangements next occupied her thoughts. The rope trailed behind her like an unwieldy tail. She hauled it painfully in toward her, rolling the end loosely round one arm. This steadied her a little, and by gripping it between her feet, a few inches below her billowing skirts, she was more likely to stay upright, she discovered. True, she still twirled and bobbed in a highly distracting fashion, but at least she was traveling in a little more decorum, and her skirts were hanging in approximately the right direction. Her bun had come down, and her locks streamed in the wind, but Sally found this remarkably refreshing. It was years since she had felt the wind blowing through her loose hair. She floated dangerously close to the spire of St. Patrick's and noticed how remarkably dirty the weathercock was at its tip. Below her she could see the new village school and the little playground, now mercifully empty. The village street wound its way beneath her, and she was thankful that it too appeared to be empty. Her pace was brisk, for the wind was now a gale, and the noise from the topmost branches of the elms beyond the school almost deafened her. She looked down upon the untidy rook's nest swaying dizzily at the top of the trees, and then swirled onward toward the open fields between Fairacre and Springbourne. At last she began to lose height. Her weight began to return, and she braced herself for the descent to earth. Alas, by this time she was in the great park of Springbourne Manor, and heading at incredible speed toward the avenue of lime trees which bordered the drive to the house. Closing her eyes and gripping the rope tightly, Sally awaited the crash. It came with a vast rending of boughs and garments. Dazed and bruised, Sally came to rest a good 30 feet above the ground, securely enmeshed in lime branches and the remains of a squirrel's dray. She was discovered by a cowman who was making his way home after milking. By that time she had thrown the rope off and descended carefully as low as she could. The last 12 feet, unfortunately, consisted of trunk alone, and it was while she was trying to brace herself to jump that the man arrived. To Sally's relief, he was a man of few words. "Hold on," he said. "I'll get a ladder." He returned in a few minutes and helped her down. They walked part of the way to Fairacre together in silence. At length he turned in to his cottage gate. "Good night," he bade her, and then added, "How'd you get up there?" Sally began the tale she had already manufactured. It involved being chased by a bull, and the best she could manage under the trying circumstances. She was aware, as she came to a faltering halt, that her rescuer was not impressed. "Must be a good leaper," he observed dryly, and went indoors. Sally, bruised and weary, dragged herself homeward, took the pot from the larder shelf, and threw it resolutely on the rubbish heap. Later that evening she thrust the exercise book into her fire, and holding it resolutely down with the poker, she watched it burn to ashes. Sally had flown for the last time. "Well, there it is, Miss Reed," said Mr. Willett, rising from his chair. "Take it or leave it. That's what Sally told my mother a year or two later, just before she died." "I don't disbelieve you," I said slowly. "It's a wonderful story. It's just that somehow—" "Well, what?" asked Mr. Willett, blowing out his mustache fiercely. "Proper Doubting Thomases some people be. It just seems remarkable that no one ever saw her, particularly on that last journey, I mean." "Ah, but they did. There was 2 little boys, brothers they were, as had been sent down to the Jug and Bottle. They saw Sally, rope and all, skidding along over the Beetle and Wedge, and tore home to tell their mum and dad. Of course, all they got was a clump on the ear-hole for being such a pair of liars, so they never said no more. And years later, when the poor old girl had gone, the landlord at the pub said he'd seen her picking plums 2 or 3 times, but never liked to say so." "I wonder why not?" I exclaimed. Mr. Willett sighed patiently. "You a school teacher, and you don't know human nature yet," he commented. "Why, people don't mind being thought downright evil and wicked, but they fair hates to seem fools. Ain't you learned that yet, Miss Reed?" He opened the kitchen door and looked out into the windy darkness. "That Coke will have to wait till tomorrow now. Goodbye, miss, and thanks for the tea. See you bright and early." And he vanished into the night. Chapter 3. Jingle Bells. Mr. Willett was as good as his word, and next morning, bright and early, I had my breakfast to the accompaniment of the brushing up of Coke in the distance. He was still at it when I crossed to the school, wielding the broom vigorously in his capable hands, his breath wreathing his head in silvery clouds. "Nasty cold morning," I called to him, scurrying toward the shelter. "This keeps me warm," he replied, pausing for a moment to rest on his broom. "But I suppose I shan't be doing this much longer." "Only 3 days," I agreed, "and then it's the lovely Christmas holidays." "You should be ashamed," said Mr. Willett reproachfully. "Young woman like you wishing your life away." But it was too cold to argue, and I only had time to wave to him before whisking into the shelter of the lobby. The last day of term, particularly the Christmas term, has a splendor of its own. There is an air of excitement at the thought of pleasure and freedom to come, but there is also a feeling of relaxation from daily routine, made much more acute by the deliciously empty desks. Books have been collected and stacked in neat piles in the cupboard. Papers and exercise books have been tidied away. All that remains to employ young hands in this last glorious day is a pencil and loose sheets of paper which have been saved for just such an occasion. Of course, work will be done. There will be mental arithmetic and some writing, perhaps some spelling lists and paper games and stories told to each other. And today, the children knew, there would be Christmas carols and a visit to the old gray church next door to see the crib recently set up by the vicar's wife and other ladies of the village. The very thought of it all created a glow which warmed the children despite the winter's cold. They entered more exuberantly than ever, cherry-nosed, hair curling damply from the December air, and Wellingtons plastered with Fairacre mud. I began to shoo them back into the lobby before our virago of a caretaker discovered them, but I was too late. Mrs. Pringle, emerging from the infants' room where she had just deposited a scuttle of coal on an outspread sheet of the Times Educational Supplement, looked at them with marked dislike. "Ain't anyone here seen fit to use the door scraper?" she asked sourly. "Don't look like it to me. What you kids want is an hour or two scrubbing this here floor like I have to. That'll make you think twice about dirtying my nice clean floorboards." She cast a malevolent glance in my direction and stumped out to the lobby. The children retreated before her, observing her marked limp, always a sure sign of trouble. The clatter of the door scraper and the bang of the heavy Gothic door announced Mrs. Pringle's departure to her cottage until midday, when she was due to return to wash up the school dinner things. The children's spirits rose again, and they sang "Away in a Manger" with rather more gusto than perhaps was necessary at prayer time. The infants departed to their own side of the partition, and my class prepared to give part of its mind to some light scholastic task. Multiplication tables are always in sore need of attention, as every teacher knows, so that a test on the scrap paper already provided seemed a useful way of passing arithmetic lesson. It was small wonder that excitement throbbed throughout the classroom. The paper chains still rustled overhead in all their multicolored glory, and in the corner, on the now depleted nature table, the Christmas tree glittered with tinsel and bright baubles. But this year it carried no parcels. Usually, Fairacre School has a party on the last afternoon of the Christmas term, when mothers and fathers and friends of the school come and eat a hearty tea and watch the children receive their presents from the tree. But this year the party was to be held in the village hall after Christmas, and a conjurer had been engaged to entertain us afterwards. However, the children guessed that they would not go home empty-handed. I felt sure, and this touching faith, which I had no intention of destroying, gave them added happiness throughout the morning. The weather grew steadily worse. Sleet swept across the playgrounds, and a wicked draught from the skylight buffeted the paper chains. I put the milk saucepan on the tortoise stove, and the children looked pleased. Although a few hardy youngsters gulped their milk down stone cold, even on the iciest day, most of them prefer to be cosseted a little, and to see their bottles being tipped into the battered saucepan. The slow heating of the milk affords them exquisite pleasure, and it usually gets more attention than I do these cold days. "It's steaming, miss," one called anxiously. "Shall I make sure the milk's all right?" queried another. "Can I get the cups ready?" asks a third. One never-to-be-forgotten day, we left the milk on whilst we had a rousing session in the playground as aeroplanes, galloping horses, trains, and other violently moving articles. On our return, breathless and much invigorated, we had discovered a sizzling, seething mess on the top and cascading down the sides of the stove. Mrs. Pringle did not let any of us forget this mishap, and the children like to pretend that they only keep reminding me to save me from incurring that lady's wrath once again. In between sips of their steaming milk, they kept up an excited chatter. "What do you want for Christmas?" Patrick asked of Ernest, his desk mate. "Boxing gloves," replied Ernest, lifting his head briefly and speaking through a white mustache. "Well, I'm having a football and a space helmet and some new crayons and a signal box for my train set," announced Patrick proudly. Linda Moffat, neat as a new pin from glossy hair to equally glossy patent leather slippers, informed me that she was hoping for a new work box with a pink lining. I thought of the small embroidery scissors shaped like a stork, which I had wrapped up for her the night before, and congratulated myself. "What do you want?" I asked Joseph Coggs, staring monkey-like at me over the rim of his mug. "Football," croaked Joseph in his hoarse gypsy voice. "Might get it, too." It occurred to me that this would make an excellent exercise in writing and spelling. Milk finished, I set them to work on long strips of paper. "Ernest wants some boxing gloves for Christmas," was the first entry. "Patrick hopes to get," began the second. The children joined in this list-making with great enthusiasm. When Mrs. Crossley, who brings the dinners, arrived, she was cross-questioned about her hopes. "Well, now, I don't really know," she confessed, balancing the tins against her wet mackintosh and peering perplexedly over the top. "A kitchen set, I think. You know, a potato masher and fish slice and all that in a nice little rack." The children obviously thought this a pretty poor present, but began to write down, "Mrs. Crossley wants a kitchen set," below the last entry, looking faintly disbelieving as they did so. "And what do you want?" asked Linda when Mrs. Cross had vanished. "Let me see," I said slowly. "Some extra nice soap, perhaps, and bath cubes, and a book or two, and a new rose bush to plant by my back door." "Is that all? No sweets?" "No, no sweets," I said, "but I should like a very pretty little ring I saw in Caxley last Saturday." "You'll have to get married for that," said Ernest soberly, "and you're too old now." The others nodded in agreement. "You're probably right," I told them, keeping a straight face. "Put your papers away and let's set the table for dinner." And we'll find out more about Christmas in Fairacre next time.